The Elder Scrolls is a series with a history that is both convoluted, conflicting, and is constantly being retconned and rewritten with each new addition to the series. So, the series will be invalidated when the Elder Scrolls 6 comes out. If it comes out. We can dream. But today, I wanted to discuss the religions and myths that came out of the heartlands of Tamriel, the stories and the people that came from Cyrodiil. But before we get to the creation myth, I wanted to briefly mention the native people of Cyrodiil and what happened to them, along with why we know next to nothing about them. The Needs, as they were known as, were humans that resided in Hammerfell, Cyrodiil and High Rock prior to the arrival of the Atmorans and the Yakudans. Their origins are lost to time, as they were swiftly subjugated into slavery by the Aelids when they arrived from the Somerset Isles. With the history of being slaves, and their legacy being heavily influenced by the Aelids, much of the Nedic culture has been lost, and as a result we know little about them. There is one in-game source that talks about their religion. It's a collectible in the Elder Scrolls Online known as the Defaced Nedic Prayer Book. In it, we see some discussion that the Needs appeared to worship the stars and the constellations, rather than the divines or other deities. The Alessian Revolt is probably the most famous event in their history, which we'll talk about in another series. All we need to know, in regards to the story coming up, is that the Needs, they basically don't influence it at all, so I don't know why I discussed it, completion's sake I guess. The Alessian incarnation of the divines that comes about after the Alessian Revolt heavily borrows from the original Aldmeri faith. You'll recognise a lot of the names coming up in this story as a result. And if you don't, you should check out my other videos that are here somewhere. Editing Poro put up the thing with the stuff. But this isn't a story about the history of the Alessian faith. Instead, let's quickly mention the Cyrodiilic Shezarr, worshipped at one time as the god of humanity, and is very clearly a parallel to Lorcan. Shezarr slowly slipped from the divine pantheon, however, and by the time of the Third Era is no longer commonly worshipped among the Empire, although some would say this is fitting. Some even say that this role came to be filled by Talos upon his ascension. Shezarr's song, in the recurring book The Monomyth, tells us about the creation of Nirn and Oblivion, but doesn't mention Anu or Padme. So, sit back, relax, and let's tell the story of creation from the point of view of the Alessian Order. This was a new thing that Shezarr described to the gods, becoming mothers and fathers, being responsible and making great sacrifices with no guarantee of success. But Shezarr spoke beautifully to them and moved them beyond mystery and tears. Thus the Aedra gave free birth to the world, the beasts and the beings, making these things from parts of themselves. This free birth was very painful, and afterwards the Aedra were no longer young and strong and powerful, as they had been at the beginning of days. Some Aedra were disappointed and bitter in their loss, and angry with Shezarr and with all of creation, for they had felt that Shezarr had lied to them and tricked them. These Aedra, the gods of the Aldmer, led by Uriel, were disgusted by their enfeebled selves and by what they had created. Everything is spoiled now and for all time, and the most we can do is teach the elven races to suffer nobly, with dignity, and chastise ourselves for our folly, and avenge ourselves upon Shezarr and his allies. Thus are the gods of the elves dark and brooding, and thus are the elves ever dissatisfied with mortality, and always proud and stoic despite the harshness of this cruel and indifferent world. Other Aedra looked upon creation and were well pleased. These Aedra, the gods of men and beastfolk, led by Akatosh, praised and cherished their wards, the mortal races. We have suffered and are diminished for all time, but the mortal world we have made is glorious, filling our hearts and spirits with hope. Let us teach the mortal races to live well, to cherish beauty and honor, and to love one another as we love them. Thus are the gods of men tender and patient, and thus are men and beastfolk great in heart for joy or suffering, and ambitious for greater wisdom and a better world. Now, when the Daedra lords heard Shezarr, they mocked him and the other Daedra.
Cut part of ourselves off and lose them forever? That's stupid. You'll be sorry. We are far smarter than you, for we will make a new world out of ourselves, but we will not cut it off or let it mock us, but we will make this world within ourselves, forever ours and under our complete control.
And so the Daedra lords created the Daedric realms, and all the ranks of lesser Daedra, great and small. And for the most part, the Daedra lords were well pleased with this arrangement, for they always had worshippers and servants and playthings close to hand. But at the same time, they sometimes looked with envy upon the mortal realms, for though mortals were foul and feeble and contemptible, their passions and ambitions were also far more surprising and entertaining than the antics of the lesser Daedra. Thus do the Daedra lords court and seduce certain amusing specimens of the mortal races, especially the passionate and the powerful. It gives the Daedra lords special pleasure to steal away from Shezarr and the Aedra, the greatest and most ambitious mortals.
Not only are you fools to mutilate yourselves,
gloat the Daedra,
but you cannot even keep the best pieces, which prefer the glory and power of the Daedra lords to the feeble vulgarity of the mush-minded Aedra.
And that's pretty much all of the story that is presented within the monomyth. To me, this story has two very interesting points. The first is that the Merethic pantheon, chiefed by Auriel, appears to be a separate pantheon to the divines chiefed by Akatosh. And although throughout the games Auriel and Akatosh are attributed to being the same being, this very deliberate split presented in this story maybe hints that they're not quite the same individual. Perhaps they have the same domain and perhaps they have the same root, but maybe they are intrinsically different creatures. Secondly, the role of the Daedra, and their interaction with Aurbis. Although briefly touched on in the Aldmurus discussion, this story points that the Daedra are drawn to the passions and ambitions of mortals like moths to a flame. Perhaps because they themselves cannot experience it, or perhaps it's something more primordial. We know, for example, that the Daedra are much more heavily tied to Padome than Anu, so perhaps it is something to do with that. It's a shame we don't have more about the Needs. They've always been footnotes in history, despite being the literal foundations of the Septim Empire. However, they've only really been explored in the Elder Scrolls Online. I think they're mentioned very briefly in other games, but for all intents and purposes, they may as well only exist in the Elder Scrolls Online. Nonetheless, the Imperials, the descendants of the Needs, took quickly to the faith of the Divines, with it creating the cornerstones from which mighty empires would rise and fall, quickly forgetting the faith of their ancestors. This faith in the gods, in the Eight and One, rarely wavers, and this faith has been carved deeply into the roots of Nirn. So while this story may not give us an insight into the mechanics of creation, it does give us more of the themes and inspirations from which to extract ideas. Parenthood, art, responsibility, sacrifice. Sometimes these concepts make for the best stories. And with that, I think I'm going to wrap up for the day. This is much later editing Poro. Thank you all very much for watching. Hope you've enjoyed. This one came out alright. It was a difficult subject matter, just because there's not a lot of meat on them bones. However, the next one is going to be a little bit more interesting. It's going to be more about the Saxheal, or the Argonians, and their views of creation. And also I want to talk a little bit about what the story represents in the next one. After that we've got the Khajiit, and then I'm going to be doing the Dunmurri interpretation of creation, which is, oh lord, is a trippy one. So thank you all very much again. If you have any feedback, comment down below. If you can leave me a like and maybe even a subscribe, that greatly helps me. and lets you know you're enjoying the content. Love you all. Stay safe. Goodbye.